The phone on Gerald Sims's desk rang at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, and his assistant knocked twice before opening the door. He was already in his chair, already 3 pages deep into a quarterly report, already certain the day held no surprises. He was wrong about that. The name on the call screen was one he had not seen in 11 years, Marcus Webb. Gerald stared at it long enough that his assistant asked if she should take a message. He told her no. He told her to close the door. He picked up the phone and said nothing for a moment, and in that silence 11 years collapsed into about 2 seconds. And Gerald Sims, plant director of Brightwell Manufacturing, felt something he could not name move through his chest like cold water. He had fired him on a Thursday in February 11 years ago. He had done it with a form and a handshake, and a box of personal items a security guard had already packed. He had done it to 412 other people that same month, but Marcus was the one who looked him in the eye and said nothing, and that nothing had lived in Gerald's memory ever since. There were nights he thought about it, not often, but on the nights when the plant was running slow or the quarterly numbers looked bad, it would surface without invitation, that particular look, patient and steady, refusing to be made small. What Gerald did not know was that Marcus Webb now owned the building they were both standing in. Marcus had bought Brightwell Manufacturing 3 weeks earlier, in a private acquisition that had not yet been announced to the plant's management team. The purchase price was $41 million. Marcus had written that check the way Gerald had once handed him a cardboard box, quietly, without ceremony, and without a word more than the situation required. The lawyers had been in a conference room in Columbus for 6 hours on the day the papers were signed. Marcus had been the calmest person in the room, which the firm's attorneys noted later, and the selling attorneys noted with some unease, because a man that calm at that kind of transaction either had nothing to lose or had already decided exactly what he was doing, and there was no other option. He was not calling to gloat. That was the thing nobody who knew the story would believe at first. It was the truth, though, and before this story is over, you will understand exactly what he was calling for, and why it mattered more than any act of revenge ever could have. Marcus had grown up in Denton, a modest working-class city in the Ohio River Valley, where the biggest employers were a paper mill, a regional hospital, and Brightwell Manufacturing, which made industrial press components and employed roughly 900 people at its peak. The city had the particular texture of a place built for industry. Low flat buildings and wide roads designed for freight trucks. A main street that had seen better decades. Neighborhoods of narrow houses with deep porches where people knew their neighbors' cars by sound. His father had worked the floor at Brightwell for 22 years. His mother had worked the cafeteria line for 11. Marcus had started there himself at 24, fresh out of a community college with an associate degree in mechanical engineering, and the specific ambition of a young man who understood, without needing it explained, that the distance between where he was and where he wanted to go would have to be walked one careful step at a time. He spent 8 years at Brightwell. He learnt the presses until he could identify a bearing running slightly off by sound alone, a soft irregular tick under the normal rhythm that most people walked past without registering. He learned the tolerances and the shift rhythms, and the names of every supervisor on every floor, and more importantly, the names of the floor workers, the ones who actually kept the lines running, the ones whose institutional knowledge lived in their hands and not in any manual. He was good at his job in a quiet way, the kind of good that doesn't announce itself, that shows up in the numbers and the reduced error rates, and the fact that the machines on his line ran 3% longer to between maintenance calls than the industry standard. The supervisors above him appreciated this in an abstract way that never quite translated into anything concrete. He was passed over for a team lead position in his 5th year. He was passed over again in his 7th. He filed neither complaint nor appeal. He went home to his apartment, made dinner for his daughter Nadia, who was 7 years old, and already asking questions about everything, and he did not carry the disappointment into the next morning. He carried it somewhere private and small, where it did not have access to his hands or his face. The apartment was 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a building that was cold in winter, because the radiator in the hallway was unreliable. He had hung Nadia's drawings on the wall above the kitchen table and put her art class projects on the windowsill, and she had a lamp in her room that cast orange light in a way she liked, and he had bought it for her used from a woman 2 floors down who was moving out. These were the details of his life in those years, and he held them the way you hold things that matter, without making a show of it. Then the winter came when the orders dried up. The auto industry had shifted suppliers. The contracts that had kept Brightwell's floor running 2 shifts a day quietly disappeared over the course of 18 months, and by January of that year the writing on the wall was visible to anyone who cared to look. Marcus cared to look. He had been watching the numbers in the quarterly reports that got posted in the break room, following the freight volume, noting which lines were running at reduced capacity, counting the parking lot at the start of the second shift, and calculating the ratio of occupied spaces to what it used to be. He had started saving aggressively 2 years before the layoffs came. He had 6 months of living expenses set aside, and a plan, fragile and specific, that he had written out by hand in a spiral notebook he kept in the nightstand drawer. He had filled 4 pages of that notebook before he felt satisfied that the plan held together, and then he had gone to sleep, which was a thing he had always been able to do once a decision was made. The day Gerald called him into the office, Marcus was not surprised. Gerald was professional about it. He went through the form item by item, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had already done this 100 times that week and was determined to do it correctly each time, regardless of the accumulation of doing it. He explained the severance package, which was 3 weeks' pay. He explained the Cobra options. He slid the box of personal items across the conference table, and Marcus recognized the green coffee mug his daughter had painted for him in her 2nd-grade art class, sitting on top of a folded photo and a spare pair of reading glasses. The mug had a lopsided sun on it and the word Dad in uneven letters, orange and yellow and a little blue, and it was the first thing his eyes went to. He looked at Gerald, and Gerald looked back, and Marcus said nothing, because everything he needed to say would take 11 years to say properly. He left the building at 2:15 in the afternoon. He drove to his mother's house, which was 12 minutes from the plant, past the same turns he had made every day of his childhood, past the laundromat and the church with the marquee sign that always had something on it, and the vacant lot on Merchant Street, where a hardware store had been before Marcus was born. He sat at his mother's kitchen table and drank the coffee she made without being asked, and when she asked him what he was going to do now, he said, without hesitation, that he was going back to school. His mother was quiet for a moment. She was a small woman who had spent 30 years doing the physical work of feeding people, and had a directness about her that came from not having the time or the inclination for indirection. Then she said, "How long?" And he said, "Long enough." And she nodded, because she had raised him to understand that a thing worth doing is worth the time it takes. And she had seen enough of the world to know that the people who moved through it with patience and clear eyes tended to arrive somewhere eventually, even when the road was not obvious. She refilled his coffee without asking, and sat down across from him, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and when he left she stood on the porch and watched him back out of the driveway the way she always had, since he was 17, as if the act of watching him go was its own kind of protection. He enrolled in the engineering program at the State University that fall. He was 33 years old. Nadia was 9, and in the 4th grade, and told her teacher her father was studying hard, which made her feel like she should study hard too. Marcus worked nights at a parts warehouse for 2 years to cover tuition and rent, driving 40 minutes each in a car that needed new shocks but would have to wait for new shocks, taking the highway in the dark at 10:30 at night after class and getting home at 2 in the morning. He did this 5 nights a week. He slept 5 hours, he made breakfast for Nadia before she left for school, and had it on the table when she came downstairs. And he was there when she got home in the afternoon, even when his eyes were tired, because the alternative was not something he was willing to consider. Then he caught a break in his 3rd year, when a professor of systems engineering named Dr. Carol Ham recognized what she was looking at and recommended him for a graduate fellowship that paid his last year and a half. He graduated with a master's degree at 37. He had missed Nadia's first middle school play for a Tuesday evening exam, and that was the only night he permitted himself to sit down on his couch and wonder whether it was worth it. He thought about it for about 20 minutes, sitting in the particular silence of an apartment, where a child is not home because she is doing something that costs you something. Then he got up, because sitting on the couch answering that question was not going to get him any closer to finding out. If you have ever watched someone work towards something for so long that the goal starts to feel abstract, almost imaginary, keep watching this one, because the thing Marcus was working toward was not abstract at all. It was very specific, and it was made of steel and fluorescent light, and the smell of machine oil, and the sound his father's boots made on the plant floor 30 years ago. He took a position at a mid-size industrial components firm in Columbus the month he graduated. He was good at the work in the same quiet way he had always been good at the work, except now the work was different, because he was designing processes instead of running them, and the canvas was larger. He sat in meetings with people who had never spent a day on a manufacturing floor, and he understood things they could not understand from the inside, and he was careful not to make that gap visible in any way that would cost him the room's trust, because the goal was not to be right in the room. The goal was to get the thing right on the floor. Within 4 years, he had risen to operations director. Within 2 more, he had been recruited to a private equity firm that specialized in distressed manufacturing assets, a phrase that sounded clinical and cold until you understood what it actually meant, which was factories that had been mismanaged into trouble, where the floor workers still knew their jobs, and the machines still worked, and the only thing that needed replacing was the decision-making at the top. Marcus was very good at recognizing the difference between a company that was broken and a company that had been failed, and that distinction turned out to do a great deal of money to people who understood it the way he did. He did not set out to buy Brightwell. That was the honest answer, and it was the one he gave later when people asked. He had been tracking the company for 3 years as part of his regular market work, the way a careful person tracks a dozen things simultaneously without having specific designs on any of them. When Brightwell came up for acquisition, distressed by the same market pressures that had been building since the layoffs, he reviewed the asset analysis the same way he reviewed all of them. The floor workforce was reduced but skilled. The equipment was aging but salvageable. The client relationships had atrophied but were not dead. The location was the same location it had always been, sitting at the edge of the same city where his father had spent 22 years and his mother had spent 11, a fact that mattered to Marcus in a way that did not show up in any spreadsheet, but that he did not pretend was not there. He put together the deal in 6 weeks. $41 million, structured as a leveraged acquisition through the firm, with Marcus carrying a significant personal stake. It was the largest transaction he had ever been the primary architect of, and he knew the night before the signing that it was the right thing, not because it felt good, but because when he walked through the risk analysis for the last time, he could not find a flaw that wasn't already accounted for. When the paperwork was signed and the transfer was complete, he drove to Denton on a Saturday morning alone, parked in the lot outside the main entrance, and sat in his car for about 4 minutes looking at the building. The fluorescent lights in the main hall were visible through the high clerestory windows, running even on a Saturday because the night shift ran 6 days. The building looked exactly the same as it had the afternoon he left it, with a cardboard box and a green coffee mug. He looked at it for 4 minutes, then he drove back. The announcement to the management team was scheduled for the following week. Marcus had reviewed the personnel files for the current leadership structure, which was standard practice in any acquisition. Gerald Sims had been plant director for 9 years, having been promoted to the role 2 years after the layoffs. His performance reviews were adequate. His relationships with the floor staff were described as functional. His personnel file contained no formal complaints and no disciplinary actions, But it also contained no particular evidence qualities that Marcus believed made a plant run well, which were clarity, consistency, and a willingness to understand the floor as the place where everything that mattered actually happened. Gerald's evaluations focused heavily on budget, compliance, and administrative throughput. There was no mention in 9 years of evaluations of the floor workers, who carried the institutional knowledge of the plant in their bodies and their habits. That absence told Marcus as much as the presence of anything else would have. He called Gerald on that Tuesday morning, not because he wanted to watch the man squirm, though he understood completely why someone who did not know him might assume otherwise. He called because he had a decision to make about Gerald's role in the restructured operation, and he had never made a decision about a person without speaking to them first. That was a principle he had carried since his father explained it to him at age 12, sitting at a table in this same city. In a house that was gone now, you look a man in the eye when you have something to say to him. You don't decide what he is before you've given him the chance to show you. The phone rang 4 times before Gerald picked up. "This is Gerald," he said. "Gerald, this is Marcus," he said. "I imagine you've heard something by now about the ownership change." There was a pause. A full breath's worth. "I got a memo this morning," Gerald said carefully, the word carefully carrying its full weight. A man arranging himself. "Good. I wanted to speak with you directly before the group meeting." "Are you free to talk?" Gerald said he was. There was a quality to his voice that Marcus recognized, the quality of a man trying to determine how much he already knows and how much he still needs to figure out. Marcus had heard it in boardrooms and on plant floors and in HR offices. He did not draw it out. "I've reviewed the asset structure and the personnel files," Marcus said. "I'd like to schedule a plant walk with you this week. Thursday, if that works. I want to see the floor and talk through the operational picture before we finalize anything about leadership." Gerald said Thursday worked. "One more thing," Marcus said. "When we walk the floor on Thursday, I want you to introduce me to the people who've been here the longest, the ones who know the machines, not the supervisors, the floor workers." There was a pause shorter this time. "Of course," Gerald said. Marcus said he would see him Thursday, and ended the call. He set the phone down on his desk in his Columbus office and looked out the window at the city below. The morning traffic moving in the usual patterns, the buildings catching the early light. Nadia was 20 years old now, and in her 2nd year at the State University, studying environmental science, and she had texted him that morning to say she had aced her watershed management midterm. He had texted back 3 words: "Proud of you." Then he had come into the office and taken Gerald's call, and now he was sitting here with 11 years settled inside him, like something that had finally been placed in its proper position, not resolved exactly, not done with, but properly placed. Thursday came with grey skies and a light sleet that was already freezing on the parking lot when Marcus arrived. Gerald was waiting at the main entrance in a pressed shirt and his plant director's badge, and he extended his hand and Marcus shook it, and the 2 men looked at each other for the first time in 11 years. Neither of them said anything about that directly. The handshake was firm on both sides, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. They walked the floor for 2 hours. The building smelled the way Marcus remembered it, oil and metal, and the particular warmth that heavy equipment generates, even when nothing dramatic is happening. Just the steady thermal mass of machines running as they were built to run. Gerald gave the tour the way a person gives a tour of something they've been responsible for, with the particular mixture of investment and defensiveness that comes from knowing exactly where all the weak points are. He talked about output capacity and maintenance schedules and the quarter's contract numbers. Marcus asked questions steadily. Specific questions about tonnage and shift capacity and the age of the hydraulic systems on lines 3 and 4, and Gerald answered them all with reasonable competence. The answers were correct. They were the answers of a man who had learned the administrative surface of a plant and tracked its numbers faithfully. They were not the answers of a man who knew the floor. He was watching something else. He was watching who Gerald didn't introduce him to. There was a woman named Ruth on line 7 who had been on the floor for 19 years and who, from 50 feet away, Marcus could see was the person the workers around her watched when something was unclear. She had the unhurried movements and the quiet authority of someone who had seen everything go wrong at least twice and learned from it both times. She caught a misaligned component on the feed rail from 12 feet away and corrected it with a single practiced motion without breaking stride or diverting her attention for more than a second. Gerald walked past her twice without stopping. The third time, Marcus stopped himself. "What's your name?" he asked her. She looked at Gerald briefly, the reflexive check of anyone who has learned to be careful in the presence of management, then back at Marcus. "Ruth Payne," she said. "How long on this line?" 14 years on 7, 5 on line 2 before that. "Tell me what the number one maintenance issue is on this line right now." Ruth didn't hesitate. She told him the seal assembly on the secondary press had been running slightly hot for 6 weeks, and the maintenance request had been filed twice, without a repair order being generated. She said she had started logging the temperature variances herself in a notebook she kept in her station drawer because she wanted documentation in case the press failed and she needed to show she had reported it. Her voice was level when she said this, the voice of a person stating facts, not making complaints. Marcus looked at Gerald. Gerald's expression was contained, a small tightening around the jaw. "I'd like to see that notebook," Marcus said to Ruth. She retrieved it from her station drawer. It was a small spiral notebook, the kind that costs $1.50, and she had been recording dates, times, and temperature readings in neat columns for 43 days. The handwriting was precise. The columns were consistent. She had noted the ambient temperature of the floor on each entry, so the variance data would be meaningful independent of seasonal fluctuation. It was, without announcement or drama, exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous thinking that kept plants from burning down. Marcus paged through it slowly. The data was clean and consistent, the kind of informal record-keeping that in a well-run plant would have been incorporated into the maintenance system 2 weeks after the first entry. He handed it back. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. He said it with the weight it deserved, not more than that, but not less. That evening he drove back to Columbus and spent an hour on the phone with the firm's operations partner, laying out his restructuring framework. The maintenance backlog would be addressed in the first 30 days, all of it, not triaged. The floor team leads, not the supervisors above them, would be the first people interviewed for the expanded leadership positions he planned to create. The plant director role would be restructured. Gerald Sims would be offered a lateral position in quality documentation, which would keep his salary intact and remove him from operational authority. The quality documentation work was genuine and genuinely needed. The certifications and compliance filings that had been handled inconsistently for years and that left the plant exposed in ways Gerald had apparently not recognized or not prioritized. If Gerald declined the role, the separation package would be fair and structured correctly, and there would be no drama about it. Marcus said all of this in a level voice with the operations partner on the other end, who was used to Marcus's levelness by now and had stopped reading anything particular into it beyond the fact that the decision was already made and was correct. He held the group management meeting the following Monday. He arrived early and stood at the front of the conference room while the managers filed in, and he watched them arrange themselves around the table with the specific seating patterns that always told you everything about internal hierarchy within the first 90 seconds. The people who sat closest to the head of the table, the people who chose the seats that allowed them to watch the door, the person who arrived last and sat in the chair nearest the exit. Gerald sat near the head of the table, which was where he always sat. Marcus introduced himself without notes. He told them who he was in 2 sentences. He said he had started his career on the floor of this plant 23 years ago. He said the plant had been good to his family for a long time, and he intended it to be good to a lot more families for a long time to come. Then he laid out the operational priorities for the first 90 days. The maintenance backlog, the floor team lead initiative, the client relationship review. He told them there would be individual meetings with each of them over the next 2 weeks. He answered 3 questions and kept the answers short, and then the meeting was over. The whole thing took 19 minutes. The managers filed out in the same configurations they had filed in, which was useful information. He met with Gerald last. They sat in the same conference room where Gerald had handed Marcus a cardboard box 11 years earlier. Marcus didn't do that on purpose. It was the only conference room on the administrative floor, and it was available. When Gerald sat down, he recognized the room, and Marcus could see that he recognized it. The brief involuntary glance at the table surface, as if checking to see if the shape of it had changed. It hadn't. Marcus laid out the restructuring proposal simply and without preamble. The plant director role was being redefined, with operational floor authority shifting to a newly created operations manager position. Gerald was being offered a director of quality documentation role at the same salary grade, with a focus on the compliance and certification work that had been underdeveloped under the current structure. He described the scope of the work specifically: the ISO certification renewal that was 18 months overdue, the state environmental compliance filings that had 3 outstanding gaps, the internal audit protocols that had not been formalized. It was real work, it was needed work, it required exactly the kind of administrative thoroughness that Gerald demonstrably had. Marcus said all of this in a level voice with Gerald's personnel file closed on the table in front of him, because nothing in it needed to be referred to in this conversation. Gerald was quiet for a long moment after Marcus finished. The sleet had started again outside. It made a soft sound against the windows, irregular, the way weather is. "You could have just let me go," he said. "Yes," Marcus said. "So why didn't you?" Marcus considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Because it wouldn't have helped the plant," he said. "And because how a person handles letting someone go says something about what they think people are worth. You were professional with me. You went through the form. You didn't send someone else to do it. That's worth something." Gerald looked at his hands, spread flat on the table. His wedding ring was plain and worn, the kind that gets that way from years of not taking it off. The room was quiet except for the sleet. "I did 413 of those that month," Gerald said. "I signed every form myself. I thought that was the right thing, to not hand it off to HR, to do it personally." He paused. "I don't know if it was the right thing. I know you didn't make the decision," Marcus said. "The contract losses made the decision. You were the one who had to carry it out." He paused one beat. "I'm not here to revisit what happened 11 years ago. I'm here to build something that runs the right way from here on out." Gerald accepted the quality documentation role. He was quiet, walking out of the conference room in a way that was different from the quiet he had walked in with, and Marcus could not say whether what had passed in the room was a burden lifted, or a burden set down differently. But Gerald showed up the following Monday in the new role, and did the work conscientiously, which was the answer that mattered. Ruth Payne was promoted to floor operations lead for lines 6, 7, and 8/6 weeks after the acquisition. The maintenance request on the secondary press seal was fulfilled within the first 10 days. The temperature variance Ruth had documented for 43 days disappeared from her notebook the morning after the repair was completed, the numbers dropping back into range like something exhaling. She kept the notebook anyway. 19 years on a manufacturing floor teaches you that documentation is never a thing you regret having. She kept it in the same drawer and added a new column, the repair date and the technician's initials, because a record without its resolution is only half a record. The plant added 94 positions over the following 8 months as the client. Relationships were rebuilt and 2 new contracts came online, one with a regional infrastructure firm and one with an agricultural equipment manufacturer in Indiana. The hiring notice went to the State Workforce Development Office, to the community college with the mechanical engineering program, and to the churches in the Denton area that had employment assistance ministries. Marcus made sure of that last part himself, calling the 3 largest congregations personally and speaking with the pastors about what they were looking for and what the plant was offering. 2 of the 3 pastors had parishioners who applied. Several were hired. One of them, a 26-year-old named Devon, who had been out of work for 8 months, was assigned to line 7 under Ruth Payne's lead and was, by the end of his first quarter, the most reliable new hire on the floor. His mother came to the plant on the day of the official reopening ceremony, which was low-key by design, a gathering in the main hall with coffee and sandwiches, and none of the spectacle that Marcus found hollow. She wore her good coat, the navy one she saved for occasions, and Marcus picked her up from her house in the morning and drove her the 12 minutes through the familiar streets. She walked the floor slowly, not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a place that had years of her life in it. She touched the counter of the cafeteria line without making anything of it. One hand rested briefly on the stainless steel edge, and then she moved on. At one point, Marcus found her standing in front of the cafeteria entrance with her hand resting lightly on the door frame. He stood beside her without saying anything. She didn't need him to say anything, and he knew that. She was taking a private moment with the building, and he gave her that without commentary. Nadia came down from Columbus that weekend. She was 20 years old, and already carrying herself like someone who had watched a person she loved work hard for a long time and understood what that looked like from the inside, not the surface of it, but the texture, the early mornings and the 5-hour nights, and the way a person holds onto a plan through the years, when the plan is a private thing that nobody can see yet. They had dinner at his mother's house, the 3 of them around the kitchen table, and the kitchen was full of the smell of the sweet potato pie his mother had put in the oven an hour before they arrived. At some point, Nadia asked him if it felt the way he had thought it would. He thought about that for a moment, not performing the thinking, actually doing it. "It feels like the work is just starting," he said. "The building was always fine. It just needed someone in it who understood what it was actually for." Nadia looked at him the way she had looked at him since she was about 7. Years old, like she was filing something away to think about later, when she had the space to think about it properly. "You remember the day you got laid off?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You came and picked me up from school that afternoon," she said. "You didn't tell me what happened, you just took me for ice cream, you didn't seem sad." I remember thinking that was strange. I was 9. I didn't understand what was going on. I just remember you seemed very calm. He looked at her across the table. She had her grandmother's eyes and her father's habit of watching things carefully before speaking about them, and both of those qualities had been evident since she was small and were still evident now, just larger. "I was calm," he said. "I had a plan." "What was the plan?" "It was a long one," he said. "It took a while to execute." His mother laughed at that, a short, warm sound, and refilled the coffee cups without asking, and the kitchen was full of the particular ease that comes when the people you love are all in the same room and nothing is pressing, and the thing you spent 11 years working toward has been done and done correctly. Marcus sat in it and let the evening happen around him without directing it anywhere. At some point he looked at the window above his mother's kitchen sink, where she had always kept a few things on the sill, a small plant, a salt shaker shaped like a rooster, and the green coffee mug. His mother had asked for it years ago when she noticed it in his apartment, after Nadia grew out of the age of painting things, and he had given it to her because she asked. He looked at the lopsided sun and the uneven orange and yellow letters, and the small amount of blue that Nadia had added in the last second on a 9-year-old's instinct for colour, and he thought that the plan, in its fullest version, had always included this kitchen, this table, these people, the mug in its place on the sill. Marcus drove back to Columbus on Sunday evening. The sleet of the previous week had given way to early spring cold, the kind that smells like something loosening, and the fields along the highway were brown and patchy but not frozen anymore. He drove with the radio off and settled into the quiet of it. He had one more decision to make that week. A second acquisition the firm had asked him to lead, a smaller plastics manufacturer in Michigan, and he had been going back and forth on the timing. He wanted Brightwell stable before he spread his attention elsewhere. He knew from experience that the first 90 days of any acquisition were the days when the culture of the place was either set or failed, and culture, once failed, was expensive to recover in ways that didn't always show up cleanly on a balance sheet. He decided to wait on Michigan. He called the firm's managing partner the next morning and explained his reasoning, and the partner agreed because the partner had seen Marcus run acquisitions before and understood by now that when Marcus said he needed more time, he was not asking for more time, he was identifying what the thing required. Some things could not be rushed. The people who understood that built things that lasted. Brightwell Manufacturing held its one-year anniversary under new ownership on a Thursday afternoon in March. Marcus was there, Ruth Payne was there, in a pressed blazer over her work clothes, standing with the other floor leads in the front of the hall. Devon was there in the second row, having come in on his day off because Ruth had mentioned it and he had decided that was where he wanted to be. Gerald Sims was in the back of the room, and he clapped when the new hire numbers were announced, and Marcus saw him do it. The clap was not performed and it was not strategic. It was the real thing. A man responding to a number that meant something to him, because he had spent 9 years trying to hold that building together with the tools and the mandate he had been given. That too was worth something. Marcus spoke briefly, 4 minutes, and he said nothing about himself. He talked about the floorworkers who had kept their skills sharp through the lean years, who had not given up on the plant even when the plant gave them every reason to. He said a factory was not a building or a balance sheet. He said it was the people who showed up every morning and knew the machines and cared whether the seals ran hot and wrote the temperature down in a notebook when nobody asked them to. He said the best thing you could do for a place was to see clearly what it needed and then not stop working until you had given it that. He held a small reception at his mother's house that evening. She had made 3 sweet potato pies, which was one more than Marcus had asked for. But she had made 3 because she knew how many people were coming, and she had done this long enough to know that 2 pies at a table like this was a promise you couldn't keep. Nadia was there with her roommate from Columbus, a quiet young woman from Cleveland who ate 2 slices and said it was the best thing she had ever tasted, and his mother accepted that the way she accepted all sincere compliments, with a composed nod and a look that said she already knew that, but appreciated having it confirmed. Marcus sat at the table and let the evening happen around him, the conversation moving from the plant to Nadia's coursework to a story his mother told about a man from the plant cafeteria from 30 years ago that made Ruth Payne, who had come with her husband, laugh until she had to set down her coffee. At one point, Marcus was alone in the kitchen for about 2 minutes while everyone else had moved to the living room, and he stood at the counter and looked at the windowsill. The mug was there in its place, the green one with the lopsided sun, orange and yellow and a little blue. He looked at it for a moment. 11 years. A plan that had once fit on 4 handwritten pages, and that had since expanded into something too large and various to fit anywhere except in the living of it. He went back to the living room and sat down. Kindness has a long memory, and so does patience, and the two together constitute something the world tends to overlook until the moment it cannot. In the months that followed, the plant ran the way a plant is supposed to run, which is to say the people on the floor were heard, the machines were maintained, and the work that needed doing got done. Ruth Payne's notebook, the small spiral one with 43 days of temperature readings, was framed and mounted in the break room on line 7, not as a monument to any failure, but as a reminder that the people closest to the work are the ones who see it most clearly, and that seeing it clearly and writing it down is not a small thing. That was the only monument Marcus asked for. That, and the fact that when the doors opened on Monday morning, every person who worked in that building knew their name was known. Have you ever watched someone build something the right way, with patience and clear eyes, and not a single shortcut? Leave a comment and tell us what that person taught you. And if this story moved you, stay close, because we have another one about a woman who gave 11 years to a company that forgot her name, and the morning the world remembered it,